the 7th century, the Arabs burst out of Arabia and conquered lands as far distant as India in the east and Spain in the west in just a couple generations. I mean, this was a dizzyingly rapid world conquest. By the 650s, so very early on in this conquest, Arab armies were already here in Syracuse on the island of Sicily. They stayed here for several years, they stocked up on plunder, and then they got back on their ships and went home. But they'd be back again in force, hundreds of ships, around 670, and then again and again and again in the early decades of the 700s. In fact, they sacked Syracuse. Poor Syracuse is going to get sacked a lot. Sacked Syracuse and ravaged the area. Now, for the first couple centuries of that conquest, the so-called Saracens had a hard time holding on to southern European territory, outside of Spain, of course. So they became, for a couple hundred years, raiders, pirates, plunderers. And the Saracens were much feared throughout Europe, particularly southern Europe. Here in Sicily, by around 730, the Byzantines had shored up defenses and made it a lot harder for the Muslims and those who fought with them to plunder here. But still, they showed up again in 740, sacked Syracuse, took it, probably would have made it the base of operations and taken over the whole island. But there was a Berber revolt back home. The Arabs and the Berbers, constant friction between these two. For centuries we'll see it. And so the forces that had taken Syracuse and this part of Sicily had to go back home. About a decade later, 752, they came back and sacked the city once again. Even when Byzantine authorities could strike a deal, like a truce with the largely Muslim invaders from North Africa, there was no guarantee that that would hold for all Saracens. That might hold for a part of North Africa, but then there'd still be raids and piracy from other parts of North Africa, as well as from Spain. By the early 800s, Corsica and Sardinia had become frequent targets of Saracen attack. The Saracens tried to take Sicily again in 812. They only failed this time thanks to a combination of bad weather and help from the Italian mainland. But they came again in 819 and then again in force in 827. And that's the year, 827. The year that the long, brutal, bloody 75-year conquest of Sicily commenced. So how did it finally happen? Well, it turns out that the North Africans probably had local help in the form of a disgruntled Byzantine commander named Euphemius. Euphemius, probably facing criminal charges and surely seeking to rule Sicily on his own anyway. In fact, he'd already tried to conquer Syracuse over there. He'd already proclaimed himself emperor, at least tried to, in the past. Anyway, he runs off to the Aghlabid court. The Aghlabids, this is a dynasty ruling in what is today Tunisia and parts of Libya and Algeria. Nominally, the Aghlabids are ruling under Abbasid authority, but truth is, like so many nominally ruling under Abbasid authority, running things completely on their own. So Euphemius runs to the Aghlabid court and asks for help. And the deal that is struck is this. The Aghlabids would help Euphemius conquer Sicily. Euphemius would rule Sicily. And Euphemius, as ruler of Sicily, would pay the Aghlabids a yearly tribute. Together, the Aghlabids, with their ships and troops, plus Euphemius's forces, battled the Byzantines. Syracuse over here was besieged for an entire year, and slowly, over the course of the fighting, the Saracens, so-called, were able to take over most of Sicily. Euphemius died in the process, by the way. Eventually, Palermo was taken too, after another year-long siege, and with the help of tens of thousands of reinforcements from Spain and tens of thousands of reinforcements from North Africa. And Palermo was made the new capital of the Aghlabids here in Sicily. I want to say a word about that term Saracen. Saracen, originally a Greek term, at least comes from a Greek word that identified a single tribe in Egypt, an Arab tribe in Egypt. Then the Christians began to use the term to apply it to any Arab person. And then the Byzantines expanded it to mean any Muslim person. And then especially during the Crusades, but even before, the Byzantines spread the term west into Central and Western Europe. And again, it was applied to any Muslim person. So that's where the term Saracen comes from. And historically, Saracen has been used by Europeans to identify the peoples that we're talking about today. Speaking of the Crusades, lest we think of all this in too black and white a fashion, too Christian versus Muslim a fashion, let's remember, first of all, there aren't very many examples in history of such black and white Christian versus Muslim wars or conflicts. It's always much more muddy than that. That's a good lesson for history in general. It's muddy. And the takeover of Sicily by the Muslims, also very muddy. Certainly not an example of straight up Christian versus Muslim. Let's remember that it was Euphemius, a Christian, and his Christian forces who first invited over the Muslims and then fought with them in his bid to take over Sicily in the first place. And you don't have to look forward much further to find more examples of this. In the mid-800s, the Duke of Naples allied with the Muslim Saracens in his fight against his rival, his Christian rival, the Prince of Benevento, and they helped him lift the Beneventan siege of Naples. Then later he helped them conquer Sicilian Messina. And then after that, the Christian Prince of Benevento also hired Saracen mercenaries. Now the Byzantines sent reinforcements, but it wasn't enough. In 860, the Byzantines sent a particularly large expedition, its goal, of course, being to win back Sicily, finally. Must have been a big expedition because it inspired many of the Sicilian cities to rise up against their Saracen masters, their new Saracen masters. So a popular revolt ensues. And despite some initial successes by this Byzantine expedition, ultimately they were booted out. They were defeated and booted out, and the popular revolts were put down. This is a common feature, by the way, of Saracen rule, at least for the first couple centuries in Sicily. Revolt after revolt having to be put down. This is a very bloody and brutal struggle. You've got reinforcements coming in from Spain all the time, just a constant stream. Reinforcements coming in from North Africa, constant stream. It's probably the only way that the Saracens could continue to put down these popular revolts. You also have migrants coming in from Spain and particularly from North Africa. Muslim migrants adding to the local population. By the first decade of the 900s, virtually all of Sicily was under the control of the Saracens. Now, the local Sicilians either had to convert from Judaism or Christianity, mostly Christianity, or they became dhimis, protected people. They were heavily taxed, Christians and Jews. Technically, they couldn't read aloud from their scriptures within earshot of a Muslim. They had to stand in the presence of Muslims. They couldn't build new churches, couldn't build new synagogues. In fact, mosques were often built on the site of churches, Christian churches. But the population of Palermo swelled. In fact, Palermo became the largest city in all of Italy during this period. 300,000 people. So it's approaching the size of Cordoba in Spain. And the only cities bigger than it in the Muslim world are Cordoba and Baghdad. That's it. And then there's Palermo. At this point, about half of Sicily is Muslim. So a major geographic shift has taken place as a result of the Saracen conquest. Now, up into the mid-900s, Sicily is being ruled under Fatimid control, the Fatimids having taken over from the Aghlabids. And then, from the mid-900s into the 1000s, Sicily, having survived Byzantine and even German attempts to retake southern Italy, morphs into an independent emirate, or at least virtually independent emirate, and then emirates. By the 1000s, Muslim power, Saracen power, was being challenged all over southern Europe. This is the time of the rise of powerful Italian city-states with their powerful fleets, which began to challenge Saracen sea power in the Mediterranean. In Sardinia, the local Sardinians teamed up with Pisa and Genoa, and together able to run the Saracens out of Sardinia. In southeastern Italy, the Emirate of Bari having existed for decades, was taken down, at first by Charlemagne's great-grandson Louis with his mostly Germanic army, and then later by the Venetians. Here in Sicily, it wasn't the Byzantines or powerful Italian city-states or Germanic armies, but it was the Normans. The Normans, that group descended from Vikings who generations before had settled in France. The Normans who took down the Saracens, starting in the 1060s and virtually completing the task by the 1090s. The Normans ruled here in Sicily for over 100 years, themselves to be replaced in 1194 by the Hohenstaufens, the German Hohenstaufens under Henry VI. And under the Hohenstaufens, the now rebellious Muslim Sicilians were deported en masse. By the mid-1200s, virtually all Muslim Sicilians had been deported. It may have appeared to some Europeans that the Muslim challenge had been met, that Saracen power in the Mediterranean was certainly on the decline for good. However, a couple centuries later, the Ottoman Turks pretty much shattered that delusion. But that's another story.